Government. Excerpted from On Human Nature. Arthur Schopenhauer. 1851. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. It is a characteristic failing of the Germans to look in the clouds for what lies at their feet. An excellent example of this is furnished by the treatment which the idea of natural right has received at the hands of professors of philosophy. When they are called upon to explain those simple relations of human life which make up the substance of this right, such as right and wrong, property, state, punishment and so on, they have recourse to the most extravagant, abstract, remote and meaningless conceptions, and out of them build a Tower of Babel reaching to the clouds, and taking this or that form according to the special whim of the professor for the time being. The clearest and simplest relations of life, such as affect us directly, are thus made quite unintelligible, to the great detriment of the young people who are educated in such a school. These relations themselves are perfectly simple and easily understood, as the reader may convince himself if he will turn to the account which I have given of them in The Foundation of Morality, section 17, and in my chief work, Book 1, section 62. But at the sound of certain words, like right, freedom, the good, being this nugatory infinitive of the cupola and many others of the same sort, the German's head begins to swim, and falling straightway into a kind of delirium he launches forth into high-flown phrases which have no meaning whatever. He takes the most remote and empty conceptions, and strings them together artificially, instead of fixing his eyes on the facts, and looking at things and relations as they really are. It is these things and relations which supply the ideas of right and freedom, and give them the only true meaning that they possess. The man who starts from the preconceived opinion that the conception of right must be a positive one, and then attempts to define it, will fail, for he is trying to grasp a shadow, to pursue a specter, to search for what does not exist. The conception of right is a negative one, like the conception of freedom, its content is mere negation. It is the conception of wrong which is positive. Wrong has the same significance as injury, lesiio in the widest sense of the term. An injury may be done either to a man's person or to his property or to his honor, and accordingly a man's rights are easy to define. Every one has a right to do anything that injures no one else. To have a right to do or claim a thing means nothing more than to be able to do or take or vice it without thereby injuring anyone else. Simplex sigillum veri. This definition shows how senseless many questions are. For instance, the question whether we have the right to take our own life. As far as concerns the personal claims which others may possibly have upon us, they are subject to the condition that we are alive, and fall to the ground when we die. To demand of a man, who does not care to live any longer for himself, that he should live on as a mere machine for the advantage of others is an extravagant pretension. Although men's powers differ, their rights are alike. Their rights do not rest upon their powers, because right is of a moral complexion. They rest on the fact that the same will to live shows itself in every man at the same stage of its manifestation. This, however, only applies to that original and abstract right, which a man possesses as a man. The property, and also the honor, which a man acquires for himself by the exercise of his powers, depend on the measure and kind of power which he possesses, and so lend his right a wider sphere of application. Here, then, equality comes to an end. The man who is better equipped, or more active, increases by adding to his gains, not his right, but the number of the things to which it extends. In my chief work I have proved that the state in its essence is merely an institution existing for the purpose of protecting its members against outward attack or inward dissension. It follows from this that the ultimate ground on which the state is necessary is the acknowledged lack of right in the human race. If right were there, no one would think of a state, for no one would have any fear that his rights would be impaired, and a mere union against the attacks of wild beasts or the elements would have very little analogy with what we mean by a state. From this point of view it is easy to see how dull and stupid are the philosophasters who in pompous phrases represent that the state is the supreme end and flower of human existence. Such a view is the apotheosis of Philistinism. If it were right that ruled in the world, a man would have done enough in building his house, and would need no other protection than the right of possessing it, which would be obvious. But since wrong is the order of the day, it is requisite that the man who has built his house should also be able to protect it. Otherwise his right is de facto incomplete. The aggressor, that is to say, has the right of might faustrecht, and this is just the conception of right which Spinoza entertains. He recognizes no other. His words are, "Unusquisque tantum juris habet quantum potentia valet," each man has as much right as he has power. And again, "Unuscujusque potentia eius definitor," each man's right is determined by his power. Hobbes seems to have started this conception of right, and he adds this strange comment that the right of the good Lord to all things rests on nothing but his omnipotence. Now this is a conception of right which, both in theory and in practice, no longer prevails in the civic world, but in the world in general, though abolished in theory, it continues to apply in practice. The consequences of neglecting it may be seen in the case of China. Threatened by rebellion within and foes without, this great empire is in a defenseless state, and has to pay the penalty of having cultivated only the arts of peace and ignored the arts of war. There is a certain analogy between the operations of nature and those of man which is a peculiar but not fortuitous character, and is based on the identity of the will in both. When the herbivorous animals had taken their place in the organic world, beasts of prey made their appearance, necessarily a late appearance in each species, and proceeded to live upon them. Just in the same way, as soon as by honest toil and in the sweat of their faces men have won from the ground what is needed for the support of their societies, a number of individuals are sure to arise in some of these societies, who, instead of cultivating the earth and living on its produce, prefer to take their lives in their hands and risk health and freedom by falling upon those who are in possession of what they have honestly earned, and by appropriating the fruits of their labor. These are the beasts of prey in the human race. They are the conquering peoples whom we find everywhere in history, from the most ancient to the most recent times. Their varying fortunes, as at one moment they succeed and at another fail, make up the general elements of the history of the world. Hence Voltaire was perfectly right when he said that the aim of all war is robbery. That those who engage in it are ashamed of their doings is clear by the fact that governments loudly protest their reluctance to appeal to arms except for purposes of self-defense. Instead of trying to excuse themselves by telling public and official lies, which are almost more revolting than war itself, they should take their stand, as bold as brass, on Machiavelli's doctrine. The gist of it may be stated to be this, that whereas between one individual and another, and so far as concerns the law and morality of their relations, the principle, don't do to others what you wouldn't like done to yourself, certainly applies, it is the converse of this principle which is appropriate in the case of nations and in politics, what you wouldn't like done to yourself do to others. If you do not want to be put under a foreign yoke, take time by the forelock, and put your neighbor under it himself, whenever, that is to say, his weakness offers you the opportunity. For if you let the opportunity pass, it will desert one day to the enemy's camp and offer itself there. Then your enemy will put you under his yoke, and your failure to grasp the opportunity may be paid for, not by the generation which was guilty of it, but by the next. This Machiavellian principle is always a much more decent cloak for the lust of robbery than the rags of very obvious lies in a speech from the head of the state, lies, too, of a description which recalls the well-known story of the rabbit attacking the dog. Every state looks upon its neighbors as at bottom a horde of robbers, who will fall upon it as soon as they have the opportunity. Between the serf, the farmer, the tenant, and the mortgagee, the difference is rather one of form than of substance. Whether the peasant belongs to me, or the land on which he has to get a living, whether the bird is mine, or its food, the tree or its fruit, is a matter of little moment, for, as Shakespeare makes Shylock say, you take my life when you do take the means whereby I live. The free peasant has, indeed, the advantage that he can go off and seek his fortune in the wide world, whereas the serf who is attached to the soil, glebe et scriptus, has an advantage which is perhaps still greater, that when failure of crops or illness, old age or incapacity, render him helpless, his master must look after him, and so he sleeps well at night, whereas, if the crops fail, his master tosses about on his bed trying to think how he is to procure bread for his men. As long ago as Menander it was said that it is better to be the slave of a good master than to live miserably as a freeman. Another advantage possessed by the free is that if they have any talents they can improve their position, but the same advantage is not wholly withheld from the slave. If he proves himself useful to his master by the exercise of any skill, he is treated accordingly, just as in ancient Rome mechanics, foremen of workshops, architects, nay, even doctors, were generally slaves. Slavery and poverty, then, are only two forms, I might almost say only two names, of the same thing, the essence of which is that a man's physical powers are employed, in the main not for himself but for others, and this leads partly to his being overloaded with work, and partly to his getting a scanty satisfaction for his needs. For nature has given a man only as much physical power as will suffice, if he exerts it in moderation, to gain a sustenance from the earth. No great superfluity of power is his. If, then, a not inconsiderable number of men are relieved from the common burden of sustaining the existence of the human race, the burden of the remainder is augmented, and they suffer. This is the chief source of the evil which under the name of slavery, or under the name of the proletariat, has always oppressed the great majority of the human race. But the more remote cause of it is luxury. In order, it may be said, that some few persons may have what is unnecessary, superfluous, and the product of refinement, nay, in order that they may satisfy artificial needs, a great part of the existing powers of mankind has to be devoted to this object, and therefore withdrawn from the production of what is necessary and indispensable. Instead of building cottages for themselves, thousands of men build mansions for a few. Instead of weaving coarse materials for themselves and their families, they make fine cloths, silk, or even lace, for the rich, and in general manufacture 1,000 objects of luxury for their pleasure. A great part of the urban population consists of workmen who make these articles of luxury, and for them and those who give them work the peasants have to plow and sow and look after the flocks as well as for themselves, and thus have more labor than nature originally imposed upon them. Moreover, the urban population devotes a great deal of physical strength, and a great deal of land, to such things as wine, silk, tobacco, hops, asparagus and so on, instead of to corn, potatoes and cattle breeding. Further, a number of men are withdrawn from agriculture and employed in shipbuilding and seafaring, in order that sugar, coffee, tea and other goods may be imported. In short, a large part of the powers of the human race is taken away from the production of what is necessary, in order to bring what is superfluous and unnecessary within the reach of a few. As long therefore as luxury exists, there must be a corresponding amount of overwork and misery, whether it takes the name of poverty or of slavery. The fundamental difference between the two is that slavery originates in violence, and poverty in craft. The whole unnatural condition of society, the universal struggle to escape from misery, the sea trade attended with so much loss of life, the complicated interests of commerce, and finally the wars to which it all gives rise is due, only and alone, to luxury, which gives no happiness even to those who enjoy it, nay, makes them ill and bad-tempered. Accordingly it looks as if the most effective way of alleviating human misery would be to diminish luxury, or even abolish it altogether. There is unquestionably much truth in this train of thought. But the conclusion at which it arrives is refuted by an argument possessing this advantage over it, that it is confirmed by the testimony of experience. A certain amount of work is devoted to purposes of luxury. What the human race loses in this way in the muscular power which would otherwise be available for the necessities of existence is gradually made up to it 1,000-fold by the nervous power, which, in a chemical sense, is thereby released. And since the intelligence and sensibility which are thus promoted are on a higher level than the muscular irritability which they supplant, so the achievements of mind exceed those of the body 1,000-fold. One wise counsel is worth the work of many hands. Greek, hos en sophon boulou metas pollen keras nika. A nation of nothing but peasants would do little in the way of discovery and invention, but idle hands make active heads. Science and the arts are themselves the children of luxury, and they discharge their debt to it. The work which they do is to perfect technology in all its branches, mechanical, chemical and physical, an art which in our days has brought machinery to a pitch never dreamt of before, and in particular has, by steam and electricity, accomplished things the like of which would, in earlier ages, have been ascribed to the agency of the devil. In manufactures of all kinds, and to some extent in agriculture, machines now do 1,000 times more than could ever have been done by the hands of all the well-to-do, educated, and professional classes, and could ever have been attained if all luxury had been abolished and every one had returned to the life of a peasant. It is by no means the rich alone, but all classes, who derive benefit from these industries. Things which in former days hardly any one could afford are now cheap and abundant, and even the lowest classes are much better off in point of comfort. In the Middle Ages a king of England once borrowed a pair of silk stockings from one of his lords, so that he might wear them in giving an audience to the French ambassador. Even Queen Elizabeth was greatly pleased and astonished to receive a pair as a New Year's present. Today every shopman has them. 50 years ago ladies wore the kind of calico gowns which servants wear now. If mechanical science continues to progress at the same rate for any length of time, it may end by saving human labor almost entirely, just as horses are even now being largely superseded by machines. For it is possible to conceive that intellectual culture might in some degree become general in the human race, and this would be impossible as long as bodily labor was incumbent on any great part of it. Muscular irritability and nervous sensibility are always and everywhere, both generally and particularly, in antagonism, for the simple reason that it is one and the same vital power which underlies both. Further, since the arts have a softening effect on character, it is possible that quarrels great and small, wars and duels, will vanish from the world, just as both have become much rarer occurrences. However, it is not my object here to write a utopia. But apart from all this, the arguments used above in favor of the abolition of luxury and the uniform distribution of all bodily labor are open to the objection that the great mass of mankind, always and everywhere, cannot do without leaders, guides and counselors, in one shape or another, according to the matter in question. Judges, governors, generals, officials, priests, doctors, men of learning, philosophers, and so on, are all a necessity. Their common task is to lead the race, for the greater part so incapable and perverse, through the labyrinth of life, of which each of them according to his position and capacity has obtained a general view, be his range wide or narrow. That these guides of the race should be permanently relieved of all bodily labor as well as of all vulgar need and discomfort, nay, that in proportion to their much greater achievements they should necessarily own and enjoy more than the common man, is natural and reasonable. Great merchants should also be included in the same privileged class, whenever they make far-sighted preparations for national needs. The question of the sovereignty of the people is at bottom the same as the question whether any man can have an original right to rule a people against its will. How that proposition can be reasonably maintained I do not see. The people, it must be admitted, is sovereign, but it is a sovereign who is always a minor. It must have permanent guardians, and it can never exercise its rights itself, without creating dangers of which no one can foresee the end, especially as, like all minors, it is very apt to become the sport of designing sharpers, in the shape of what are called demagogues. Voltaire remarks that the first man to become a king was a successful soldier. It is certainly the case that all princes were originally victorious leaders of armies, and for a long time it was as such that they bore sway. On the rise of standing armies, princes began to regard their people as a means of sustaining themselves and their soldiers, and treated them, accordingly, as though they were a herd of cattle, which had to be tended in order that it might provide wool, milk, and meat. The why and wherefore of all this, as I shall presently show in detail, is the fact that originally it was not right, but might, that ruled in the world. Might has the advantage of having been the first in the field. That is why it is impossible to do away with it and abolish it altogether. It must always have its place, and all that a man can wish or ask is that it should be found on the side of right and associated with it. Accordingly says the prince to his subjects, I rule you in virtue of the power which I possess. But, on the other hand, it excludes that of any one else, and I shall suffer none but my own, whether it comes from without or arises within by one of you trying to oppress another. In this way, then, you are protected. The arrangement was carried out, and just because it was carried out the old idea of kingship developed with time and progress into quite a different idea, and put the other one in the background, where it may still be seen, now and then, flitting about like a spectre. Its place has been taken by the idea of the king as father of his people, as the firm and unshakable pillar which alone supports and maintains the whole organization of law and order, and consequently the rights of every man. But a king can accomplish this only by inborn prerogative which reserves authority to him and to him alone, an authority which is supreme, indubitable, and beyond all attack, nay, to which every one renders instinctive obedience. Hence the king is rightly said to rule by the grace of God. He is always the most useful person in the state, and his services are never too dearly repaid by any civil list, however heavy. But even as later writer as Machiavelli was so decidedly imbued with the earlier or medieval conception of the position of a prince that he treats it as a matter which is self-evident, he never discusses it, but tacitly takes it as the presupposition and basis of his advice. It may be said generally that his book is merely the theoretical statement and consistent and systematic exposition of the practice prevailing in his time. It is the novel statement of it in a complete theoretical form that lends it such a poignant interest. The same thing, I may remark in passing, applies to the immortal little work of La Rochefoucauld called, who, however, takes private and not public life for his theme, and offers, not advice, but observations. The title of this fine little book is open, perhaps, to some objection. The contents are not, as a rule, either maxims or reflections, but aperçus, and that is what they should be called. There is much, too, in Machiavelli that will be found also to apply to private life. Right in itself is powerless, in nature it is might that rules. To enlist might on the side of right, so that by means of it right may rule, is the problem of statesmanship. And it is indeed a hard problem, as will be obvious if we remember that almost every human breast is the seat of an egoism which has no limits, and is usually associated with an accumulated store of hatred and malice, so that at the very start feelings of enmity largely prevail over those of friendship. We have also to bear in mind that it is many millions of individuals so constituted who have to be kept in the bonds of law and order, peace and tranquility, whereas originally every one had a right to say to every one else, I am just as good as you are. A consideration of all this must fill us with surprise that on the whole the world pursues its way so peacefully and quietly, and with so much law and order as we see to exist. It is the machinery of state which alone accomplishes it. For it is physical power alone which has any direct action on men, constituted as they generally are. It is for physical power alone that they have any feeling or respect. If a man would convince himself by experience that this is the case, he need do nothing but remove all compulsion from his fellows, and try to govern them by clearly and forcibly representing to them what is reasonable, right, and fair, though at the same time it may be contrary to their interests. He would be laughed to scorn, and as things go that is the only answer he would get. It would soon be obvious to him that moral force alone is powerless. It is, then, physical force alone which is capable of securing respect. Now this force ultimately resides in the masses, where it is associated with ignorance, stupidity and injustice. Accordingly, the main aim of statesmanship in these difficult circumstances is to put physical force in subjection to mental force to intellectual superiority, and thus to make it serviceable. But if this aim is not itself accompanied by justice and good intentions, the result of the business, if it succeeds, is that the state so erected consists of knaves and fools, the deceivers and the deceived. That this is the case is made gradually evident by the progress of intelligence amongst the masses, however much it may be repressed, and it leads to revolution. But if, contrarily, intelligence is accompanied by justice and good intentions, there arises a state as perfect as the character of human affairs will allow. It is very much to the purpose if justice and good intentions not only exist, but are also demonstrable and openly exhibited, and can be called to account publicly and be subject to control. Care must be taken, however, lest the resulting participation of many persons in the work of government should affect the unity of the state, and inflict a loss of strength and concentration on the power by which its home and foreign affairs have to be administered. This is what almost always happens in republics. To produce a constitution which should satisfy all these demands would accordingly be the highest aim of statesmanship. But, as a matter of fact, statesmanship has to consider other things as well. It has to reckon with the people as they exist, and their national peculiarities. This is the raw material on which it has to work, and the ingredients of that material will always exercise a great effect on the completed scheme. Statesmanship will have achieved a good deal if it so far attains its object as to reduce wrong and injustice in the community to a minimum. To banish them altogether, and to leave no trace of them, is merely the ideal to be aimed at, and it is only approximately that it can be reached. If they disappear in one direction, they creep in again in another, for wrong and injustice lie deeply rooted in human nature. Attempts have been made to attain the desired aim by artificial constitutions and systematic codes of law, but they are not in complete touch with the facts. They remain an asymptote, for the simple reason that hard and fast conceptions never embrace all possible cases, and cannot be made to meet individual instances. Such conceptions resemble the stones of a mosaic rather than the delicate shading in a picture. Nay, more, all experiments in this matter are attended with danger, because the material in question, namely, the human race, is the most difficult of all material to handle. It is almost as dangerous as an explosive. No doubt it is true that in the machinery of the state the freedom of the press performs the same function as a safety valve in other machinery, for it enables all discontent to find a voice. Nay, in doing so, the discontent exhausts itself if it has not much substance, and if it has, there is an advantage in recognizing it betimes and applying the remedy. This is much better than to repress the discontent, and let it simmer and ferment, and go on increasing until it ends in an explosion. On the other hand, the freedom of the press may be regarded as a permission to sell poison for the heart and the mind. There is no idea so foolish but that it cannot be put into the heads of the ignorant and incapable multitude, especially if the idea holds out some prospect of any gain or advantage. And when a man has got hold of any such idea, what is there that he will not do? I am, therefore, very much afraid that the danger of a free press outweighs its utility, particularly where the law offers a way of redressing wrongs. In any case, however, the freedom of the press should be governed by a very strict prohibition of all and every anonymity. Generally, indeed, it may be maintained that right is of a nature analogous to that of certain chemical substances, which cannot be exhibited in a pure and isolated condition, but at the most only with a small admixture of some other substance, which serves as a vehicle for them, or gives them the necessary consistency, such as fluorine, or even alcohol, or prussic acid. Pursuing the analogy, we may say that right, if it is to gain a footing in the world and really prevail, must of necessity be supplemented by a small amount of arbitrary force, in order that, notwithstanding its merely ideal and therefore ethereal nature, it may be able to work and subsist in the real and material world, and not evaporate and vanish into the clouds, as it does in Hesiod. Birthright of every description, all heritable privileges, every form of national religion, and so on, may be regarded as the necessary chemical base or alloy, inasmuch as it is only when right has some such firm and actual foundation that it can be enforced and consistently vindicated. They form for right a sort of, Greek, os moi pusto e fulcrum for supporting its lever. Linnaeus adopted a vegetable system of an artificial and arbitrary character. It cannot be replaced by a natural one, no matter how reasonable the change might be, or how often it has been attempted to make it, because no other system could ever yield the same certainty and stability of definition. Just in the same way the artificial and arbitrary basis on which, as has been shown, the constitution of a state rests, can never be replaced by a purely natural basis. A natural basis would aim at doing away with the conditions that have been mentioned. In the place of the privileges of birth it would put those of personal merit, in the place of the national religion, the results of rationalistic inquiry, and so on. However agreeable to reason this might all prove, the change could not be made, because a natural basis would lack that certainty and fixity of definition which alone secures the stability of the Commonwealth. A constitution which embodied abstract right alone would be an excellent thing for natures other than human, but since the great majority of men are extremely egoistic, unjust, inconsiderate, deceitful, and sometimes even malicious, since in addition they are endowed with very scanty intelligence, there arises the necessity for a power that shall be concentrated in one man, a power that shall be above all law and right, and be completely irresponsible, nay, to which everything shall yield as to something that is regarded as a creature of a higher kind, a ruler by the grace of God. It is only thus that men can be permanently held in check and governed. The United States of North America exhibit the attempt to proceed without any such arbitrary basis, that is to say, to allow abstract right to prevail pure and unalloyed. But the result is not attractive. For with all the material prosperity of the country, what do we find? The prevailing sentiment is a base utilitarianism with its inevitable companion, ignorance, and it is this that has paved the way for a union of stupid Anglican bigotry, foolish prejudice, coarse brutality, and a childish veneration of women. Even worse things are the order of the day, most iniquitous oppression of the black freeman, lynch law, frequent assassination often committed with entire impunity, duels of a savagery elsewhere unknown, now and then open scorn of all law and justice, repudiation of public debts, abominable political rascality towards a neighboring state, followed by a mercenary raid on its rich territory, afterwards sought to be excused, on the part of the chief authority of the state, by lies which every one in the country knew to be such and laughed at an ever-increasing autocracy. And finally all the disastrous influence which this abnegation of justice in high quarters must have exercised on private morals. This specimen of a pure constitution on the obverse side of the planet says very little for republics in general, but still less for the imitations of it in Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, and Peru. A peculiar disadvantage attaching to republics, and one that might not be looked for, is that in this form of government it must be more difficult for men of ability to attain high position and exercise direct political influence than in the case of monarchies. For always and everywhere and under all circumstances there is a conspiracy, or instinctive alliance, against such men on the part of all the stupid, the weak, and the commonplace. They look upon such men as their natural enemies, and they are firmly held together by a common fear of them. There is always a numerous host of the stupid and the weak, and in a republican constitution it is easy for them to suppress and exclude the men of ability, so that they may not be outflanked by them. They are 50 to 1, and here all have equal rights at the start. In a monarchy, on the other hand, this natural and universal league of the stupid against those who are possessed of intellectual advantages is a one-sided affair. It exists only from below, for in a monarchy talent and intelligence receive a natural advocacy and support from above. In the first place, the position of the monarch himself is much too high and too firm for him to stand in fear of any sort of competition. In the next place, he serves the state more by his will than by his intelligence, for no intelligence could ever be equal to all the demands that would in his case be made upon it. He is therefore compelled to be always availing himself of other men's intelligence. Seeing that his own interests are securely bound up with those of his country, that they are inseparable from them and one with them, he will naturally give the preference to the best men, because they are his most serviceable instruments, and he will bestow his favor upon them as soon, that is, as he can find them, which is not so difficult, if only an honest search be made. Just in the same way even ministers of state have too much advantage over rising politicians to need to regard them with jealousy, and accordingly for analogous reasons they are glad to single out distinguished men and set them to work, in order to make use of their powers for themselves. It is in this way that intelligence has always under a monarchical government a much better chance against its irreconcilable and ever-present foe, stupidity, and the advantage which it gains is very great. In general, the monarchical form of government is that which is natural to man, just as it is natural to bees and ants, to a flight of cranes, a herd of wandering elephants, a pack of wolves seeking prey in common, and many other animals, all of which place one of their number at the head of the business in hand. Every business in which men engage, if it is attended with danger, every campaign, every ship at sea must also be subject to the authority of one commander, everywhere it is one will that must lead. Even the animal organism is constructed on a monarchical principle, it is the brain alone which guides and governs, and exercises the hegemony. Although heart, lungs, and stomach contribute much more to the continued existence of the whole body, These Philistines cannot on that account be allowed to guide and lead. That is a business which belongs solely to the brain. Government must proceed from one central point. Even the solar system is monarchical. On the other hand, a republic is as unnatural as it is unfavorable to the higher intellectual life in the arts and sciences. Accordingly, we find that everywhere in the world, and at all times, nations, whether civilized or savage, or occupying a position between the two, are always under monarchical government. The rule of many, as Homer said, is not a good thing. Let there be one ruler, one king. Greek, alkagathon polykoirin eis koiranos esto eis basileus. How would it be possible that, everywhere and at all times, we should see many millions of people, nay, even hundreds of millions, become the willing and obedient subjects of one man, sometimes even one woman, and provisionally, even, of a child, unless there were a monarchical instinct in men which drove them to it as the form of government best suited to them? This arrangement is not the product of reflection. Everywhere one man is king, and for the most part his dignity is hereditary. He is, as it were, the personification, the monogram, of the whole people, which attains an individuality in him. In this sense he can rightly say, l'état c'est moi. It is precisely for this reason that in Shakespeare's historical plays the kings of England and France mutually address each other as France and England, and the Duke of Austria goes by the name of his country. It is as though the kings regarded themselves as the incarnation of their nationalities. It is all in accordance with human nature, and for this very reason the hereditary monarch cannot separate his own welfare and that of his family from the welfare of his country, as, on the other hand, mostly happens when the monarch is elected, as, for instance, in the states of the Church. The Chinese can conceive of a monarchical government only. What a republic is they utterly fail to understand. When a Dutch legation was in China in the year 1658, it was obliged to represent that the Prince of Orange was their king, as otherwise the Chinese would have been inclined to take Holland for a nest of pirates living without any lord or master. Stobæus, in a chapter in his Florilegium, at the head of which he wrote that monarchy is best, collected the best of the passages in which the ancients explained the advantages of that form of government. In a word, republics are unnatural and artificial, they are the product of reflection. Hence it is that they occur only as rare exceptions in the whole history of the world. There were the small Greek republics, the Roman and the Carthaginian, but they were all rendered possible by the fact that 5/6, perhaps even 7/8, of the population consisted of slaves. In the year 1840, even in the United States, there were 3 million slaves to a population of 16 millions. Then, again, the duration of the republics of antiquity, compared with that of monarchies, was very short. Republics are very easy to found, and very difficult to maintain, while with monarchies it is exactly the reverse. If it is utopian schemes that are wanted, I say this, the only solution of the problem would be a despotism of the wise and the noble, of the true aristocracy and the genuine nobility, brought about by the method of generation, that is, by the marriage of the noblest men with the cleverest and most intellectual women. This is my utopia, my Republic of Plato. Constitutional kings are undoubtedly in much the same position as the gods of Epicurus, who sit upon high in undisturbed bliss and tranquility, and do not meddle with human affairs. Just now they are the fashion. In every German duodecimo principality a parody of the English constitution is set up, quite complete, from upper and lower houses down to the habeas corpus act and trial by jury. These institutions, which proceed from English character and English circumstances, and presuppose both, are natural and suitable to the English people. It is just as natural to the German people to be split up into a number of different stocks, under a similar number of ruling princes, with an emperor over them all, who maintains peace at home, and represents the unity of the state board. It is an arrangement which has proceeded from German character and German circumstances. I am of opinion that if Germany is not to meet with the same fate as Italy, it must restore the imperial crown, which was done away with by its archenemy, the first Napoleon, and it must restore it as effectively as possible. For German unity depends on it, and without the imperial crown it will always be merely nominal, or precarious. But as we no longer live in the days of Gunther of Schwarzburg, when the choice of emperor was a serious business, the imperial crown ought to go alternately to Prussia and to Austria, for the life of the wearer. In any case, the absolute sovereignty of the small states is illusory. Napoleon I did for Germany what Otto the Great did for Italy, he divided it into small, independent states, on the principle, divide et impera. The English show their great intelligence, amongst other ways, by clinging to their ancient institutions, customs and usages, and by holding them sacred, even at the risk of carrying this tenacity too far, and making it ridiculous. They hold them sacred for the simple reason that those institutions and customs are not the invention of an idle head, but have grown up gradually by the force of circumstance and the wisdom of life itself, and are therefore suited to them as a nation. On the other hand, the German Michel allows himself to be persuaded by his schoolmaster that he must go about in an English dress coat, and that nothing else will do. Accordingly he has bullied his father into giving it to him, and with his awkward manners this ungainly creature presents in it a sufficiently ridiculous figure. But the dress coat will someday be too tight for him and incommode him. It will not be very long before he feels it in trial by jury. This institution arose in the most barbarous period of the Middle Ages, the times of Alfred the Great, when the ability to read and write exempted a man from the penalty of death. It is the worst of all criminal procedures. Instead of judges, well versed in law and of great experience, who have grown grey in daily unraveling the tricks and wiles of thieves, murderers and rascals of all sorts, and so are well able to get at the bottom of things, it is gossiping tailors and tanners who sit in judgment. It is their coarse, crude, unpracticed, and awkward intelligence, incapable of any sustained attention, that is called upon to find out the truth from a tissue of lies and deceit. All the time, moreover, they are thinking of their cloth and their leather, and longing to be at home, and they have absolutely no clear notion at all of the distinction between probability and certainty. It is with this sort of a calculus of probabilities in their stupid heads that they confidently undertake to seal a man's doom. The same remark is applicable to them which Dr. Johnson made of a court-martial in which he had little confidence, summoned to decide a very important case. He said that perhaps there was not a member of it who, in the whole course of his life, had ever spent an hour by himself in balancing probabilities. Can anyone imagine that the tailor and the tanner would be impartial judges? What? The vicious multitude impartial. As if partiality were not 10 times more to be feared from men of the same class as the accused than from judges who knew nothing of him personally, lived in another sphere altogether, were irremovable, and conscious of the dignity of their office. But to let a jury decide on crimes against the state and its head, or on misdemeanors of the press, is in a very real sense to set the fox to keep the geese. Everywhere and at all times there has been much discontent with governments, laws and public regulations, for the most part, however, because men are always ready to make institutions responsible for the misery inseparable from human existence itself, which is, to speak mythically, the curse that was laid on Adam, and through him on the whole race. But never has that delusion been proclaimed in a more mendacious and impudent manner than by the demagogues of the jet side of the day we live in. As enemies of Christianity, they are, of course, optimists. To them the world is its own end and object, and accordingly in itself, that is to say, in its own natural constitution, it is arranged on the most excellent principles, and forms a regular habitation of bliss. The enormous and glaring evils of the world they attribute wholly to governments. If governments, they think, were to do their duty, there would be a heaven upon earth. In other words, all men could eat, drink, propagate and die, free from trouble and want. This is what they mean when they talk of the world being its own end and object. This is the goal of that perpetual progress of the human race, and the other fine things which they are never tired of proclaiming. Formerly it was faith which was the chief support of the throne, nowadays it is credit. The Pope himself is scarcely more concerned to retain the confidence of the faithful than to make his creditors believe in his own good faith. If in times past it was the guilty debt of the world which was lamented, now it is the financial debts of the world which arouse dismay. Formerly it was the last day which was prophesied, now it is the Greek, Sisashthia, the great repudiation, the universal bankruptcy of the nations, which will one day happen, although the prophet, in this as in the other case, entertains a firm hope that he will not live to see it himself. From an ethical and a rational point of view, the right of possession rests upon an incomparably better foundation than the right of birth. Nevertheless, the right of possession is allied with the right of birth and has come to be part and parcel of it, so that it would hardly be possible to abolish the right of birth without endangering the right of possession. The reason of this is that most of what a man possesses he inherited, and therefore holds by a kind of right of birth, just as the old nobility bear the names only of their hereditary estates, and by the use of those names do no more than give expression to the fact that they own the estates. Accordingly all owners of property, if instead of being envious they were wise, ought also to support the maintenance of the rights of birth. The existence of a nobility has, then, a double advantage. It helps to maintain on the one hand the rights of possession, and on the other the right of birth belonging to the king. For the king is the first nobleman in the country, and, as a general rule, he treats the nobility as his humble relations, and regards them quite otherwise than the commoners, however trusty and well-beloved. It is quite natural, too, that he should have more confidence in those whose ancestors were mostly the first ministers, and always the immediate associates, of his own. A nobleman, therefore, appeals with reason to the name he bears, When on the occurrence of anything to rouse distrust, he repeats his assurance of fidelity and service to the king. A man's character, as my readers are aware, assuredly comes to him from his father. It is a narrow-minded and ridiculous thing not to consider whose son a man is.